President Biden is altering the balance of the nation's courts. We'll talk to Carrie Severino, who keeps a very close eye on all things judicial. Hi, I'm Stuart Shepard, and this is First Liberty Live. Thank you for liking and sharing our videos. You are an important part of this project, and we appreciate the fact that you care about these issues enough to share these conversations with your friends so that they can join in on them as well. Carrie Severino is president of the Judicial Crisis Network. She's also, you've seen her on Fox News, you've seen her on CNN, you've seen her on MSNBC, bless you for that, and also on C-SPAN and other places. She's a co-author of the best-selling book that's titled Justice on Trial. It's about Brett Kavanaugh's nomination and process, as well as the future of the Supreme Court. So I thought she would be perfect to talk to about all of this. Hi, Carrie.
Hi, how are you doing?
I'm great. I appreciate you making time for us today. It's great to have you on and get your thoughts on all this. As you look across all the nominees that the president has put forth to go on the nation's courts at all different levels, what's your read on that? What do you see? What do you think?
It's definitely a very different last few years than the previous term, isn't it? We've got a different focus by the president. And unfortunately, it's been a very discouraging few years in terms of judicial nominations. The President Biden seems to be looking more to check certain demographic boxes, to give handouts to different groups that he wants to curry favor with, rather than looking to find judges who are going to be faithful to the Constitution and the rule of law. Now, unfortunately, while I think that looking at what the Constitution says and what the law actually just says and interpreting it that way should be the best thing for whatever party. It means if you've got a liberal law passed by a liberal Congress and signed by a Democratic president, you interpret that strictly. You interpret same way as you would a Republican passed piece of legislation. But unfortunately, on the left, that isn't a approach that's in vogue, largely because for the last 50-some years, up until really recently, they had such a stronghold on the courts that they were starting to view that as their branch of government. That's where they could go. Like if they had something that was too radical to get past Congress, they would just go to the court. The courts would just give it to them. Or they'd get half the loaf in Congress, and instead of going back for the other half, like Ronald Reagan said, they would just go to the courts for the other half. The courts would make them a ham and cheese sandwich out of it. So this was a real problem, and they're so angry that they've lost that gimme, that automatic court, that they have just kind of gone whole hog even farther. So we've seen both, I think, not a focus on the right things, and we've seen a focus on nominees that are truly extreme, who said things, that just full-on embrace of CRT. Microaggressions are violence, was what one said. We've had nominees who are so focused on, maybe the other ideological things that they don't even know the Constitution. We had one recently who couldn't answer questions about what is Article 2 of the Constitution? What is Article 5 of the Constitution? These are things that should have been taught, in a high school civics class. And you would hope that you'd have a nominee that would review these before they would go, say, before the Senate Judiciary Committee for their, biggest job interview of a lifetime. And apparently that's not on the top of their list.
Well,
and that's unfortunately...
If you are an activist in the court system, you don't really need the Constitution. I mean, that's kind of the departure point for all this. I think it's helpful. We often hear people describe nominees as conservative or liberal, but really what we're talking about is whether they try to adhere to the words of the Constitution, and there are different philosophies about that, or whether they're more concerned about outcomes and reinterpreting the Constitution in their own view. And part of what strikes me about that is, if you're a conservative, to use the common language, and you look to the Constitution for guidance, you will sometimes come up with decisions that you personally don't like. But if you're an activist, you like every outcome of every decision because you can do whatever you want. Do you agree with that?
I think that's absolutely right. I've heard recent Republican nominees tell me that that's one of the hardest parts of the job is you see a law that's either really a bad law or sometimes they're just sloppily worded, or they're old laws that really need to be updated and Congress isn't doing its job. But your job as the court isn't to go beyond that, isn't to make something up that you think would be better. You have to follow it as it's written. And again, I think that's something that should appeal to people on both sides of the aisle at the end of the day. And I think really it's interesting, very telling that I think most Americans do agree with that. Because if you look at the things that, for example, Ketanji Brown Jackson, the newest justice on the court, said at her confirmation hearing, she used a lot of those words, didn't she? She said things like, oh, yes, no, I believe the Constitution should be interpreted as written and the text of the law should be interpreted as written. And yet at the same time, she said, well, I'm not an originalist, so I'm not a textualist. And she refused to really give answers. It shows, I think, that even the liberals and even the Democrats recognize most Americans really do want judges who are going to be faithful to the rule of law.
Yeah. Most people hear about the nominees and they know that there's a process, but I dare say most Americans have forgotten what we learned back in high school, as you talked about. Walk us through the process. It's not just the president appointing people to the court. I often hear people say it's an appointee. Not really an appointee, is it? There's a process. Describe for us that constitutional process that has to be gone through to get someone from being a nominee to being actually on a court.
That's right. So as we know, the Constitution is set up with purposeful checks and balances so that each of the branches could check each other. So we have the president on the one hand, who's just running the show in many ways, but they realized when you have just everything in one power, there's a lot of downsides to that. There's a lot of danger. That's what they saw with King George, right? So they wanted to make sure they split it up. So they made sure they separated out one of the main functions that the king used to have in England, which is they can't make the laws. The president doesn't make the law. That's the rule of the legislature. And we know how that, the two houses of Congress, the bill becomes a law. Yeah. But then we have another branch that was also being abused by the British Crown, and that's the courts. You can't have the courts also underneath it, because then you've got the same people bringing the case as deciding the case, and the courts need to be separate. The way they decided to do that and create that check, you've got the president who has the initiative. The president has the power of nomination. And the early Federalists defending the Constitution said this is good because it means that there's one person where the buck stops, kind of. The responsibility is the president has to pick someone good. If you could just pass it off to a committee, and some states do that, there's a lot of people who can just kind of pass the blame on if you get a bad nominee. The president has to take credit for it, but they can't just have free reign, because they thought, well, that's going to lead to nepotism and just personal favorites getting appointed. We want the Senate to have a check to make sure we're getting quality nominees at the same time. So the president will nominate someone for any of the federal judicial spots. That means obviously the Supreme Court, which we see all the time, those 9 justices, but also the 13 different appellate courts throughout the country. Those are divided into circuits, for the most part, just by different groups of states being put together. Right. And then the district courts, they do the trials. So all of those, the president gets to choose, and particularly at the lower levels, he'll also have a lot of input from the senators from those states. Because again, the Senate is going to be the final check on those. You need a majority vote in the Senate to get that person confirmed. And there's often an outsized weight also placed on the senators from that state. If, and the Supreme Court is for the whole country, but say you've got someone from the Northern District of California, the president's going to then talk to the senators from California to try to get their input as he's going through this nominations process, then ultimately chooses a nominee. They have a hearing in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and then they go up for a vote. And if they're voted on, they're on for life.
Now, it wasn't that many years ago that it took more than a simple majority to confirm a nominee, because there was a higher bar that had to be passed in the Senate. That was changed first for the appeals courts and then for the Supreme Court. Walk us through that. How different is it now that it's just a simple majority rather than that higher hurdle to get someone on the court system?
Well, yeah, and really returning to the simple majority is returning more to the historical practice. Because if we look throughout almost the entire sweep of American history, judges were not the political footballs they are now. Every once in a while, you get a particular fight where there's a nominee or a particular president that really got people's goat. But generally speaking, if you had a nominee who was qualified and a reasonable nominee, they would get passed. Historically, a lot of them were passed they would not pass without a hearing. Some of them were passed without them even knowing they had been nominated. They find out after they've already been confirmed that they were nominated for the position. So it used to be simpler. Really what we saw was in 2003, the Democrats, they'd been kind of starting to weaponize this process for a while. With the Bork hearings, they really first realized, hey, we don't have to just confirm anyone. We can actually block these people. That's trickled down to not just the Supreme Court level, but then to the appellate levels. And they realized even if they don't have a majority in the Senate, with Bork, he was blocked because they had a majority vote, they would have voted against him, right?
Right.
They said, well, we want to be able to block nominees without a majority. So they utilized the filibuster process, which, we think of Mr. Smith goes to Washington and you have to stand on the floor and keep talking the whole time. That's not how it works. What it really means is you have a vote for them to say, we're done debating this topic and we're going to move on to a vote. So always, actually, the vote for passage has been 51 votes. They still always just needed a majority. But to be able to get to that vote, they have to do what's called pass a cloture vote. File cloture, which means we're ending debate. And that threshold was higher. That was a 60 vote threshold.
Right.
The Democrats said, wait a minute, even if we don't have the votes to block this person, we don't have to have a vote on them. So in 2003, for the first time, that was used, not against legislation, which it's been used on and off historically a lot, but against a judicial nominee in a purely partisan fashion. And so that then became the new norm. And so then it became, you need 60 votes, not to get to your vote in the first place. And that really changed the process. It made it very hard, particularly for President Bush, the second Bush, to get any nominees through, because a minority of senators was effectively having a stranglehold on all these judges to be confirmed. Finally, and this is, I think, a good lesson to be learned, the only way that was changed was when it became clear that what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. And when Democrats started, when the tables were turned, when Obama's nominating and the Republicans said, okay, if you're gonna filibuster difficult nominees, we'll do it too.
Yeah.
Suddenly,
you showed us how.
World's watching. They're like, how could you do this? This is un-American. So they had to get rid of it. And while they technically left it in place for the Supreme Court, it really explicitly, because a lot of people were worried that, hey, what if we got a Supreme Court nominee that might be willing to overturn a case like Roe? We want to have the filibuster in place. When Justice Gorsuch was confirmed to replace Antonin Scalia, I think he was a really good choice, because with that 60 vote threshold, you needed someone who was such a clearly obvious, great candidate, really well qualified, really level headed, that when the Democrats filibustered him, which everyone thought was probably inevitable, and it turns out was inevitable, they did try to filibuster him, that you had to have someone who is so clearly a great nominee that you could get 51 Republicans to say, you know what, we're changing this rule. Because while there's that 60 vote threshold to get to the vote, they actually could change that threshold with just 51. And so, while there were a lot of senators who didn't want to change that threshold, they realized this is just, if they're going to filibuster Neil Gorsuch, effectively, they're going to filibuster anyone. I think that was correct. I'm very glad they did that. It allowed us to go back to a world where presidents actually can get their nominees confirmed without having to have a supermajority of the Senate. And that's really what the historic practice has been.
Let's talk about the balance of the courts. We've talked about the different philosophies, and there are essentially two camps, those who look to the Constitution for guidance and those who feel like it's a living document they need to reinterpret. Looking across the court system, with the seats that are empty, the ones that President Biden could nominate people to fill, how much impact can he have, really, in the years that he has left in office at this point?
Well, as we were just talking, procedural minutiae really do matter. And we're seeing already with the beginning of the Biden administration how effective some of the changes in procedure that happened midway through the Trump term have been. Because so far, Biden actually is ahead of where Trump was at this stage in his presidency in terms of filling those seats. He just passed his 100th confirmed his 100th judge. So he is having an impact in terms of just pure numerics. Part of that is because of some changes that happened, again, to the cloture process. You could still, now you can get past it with 51 votes. But for much of the Trump administration, even after that time, for every judge, there were 30 hours of debate that were automatically tacked on then.
Right.
And the idea is you would normally use that for real debate, but people were just using it to run out the clock. They weren't talking about the judges. They just used that time. So Trump had kind of the brakes on the whole first couple of years of his administration. Biden did not. They finally changed those rules. So he has been going very quickly. So in one sense, this is not great news. On the other hand, the nominees he's been putting up I don't think are set out to be the types of leaders that we had in the last administration. if you look at comparisons of did they graduate from top law schools, did they graduate summa cum laude, did they graduate, Order of the Cloth, all of these different did they clerk at the Supreme Court? It's clear that Biden's judges are not, they aren't bringing the same intellectual firepower that Trump's did. I think also when you look at where the vacancies happen to be, and some of that's luck with the timing of who retires when, he's adding a lot of judges, but he hasn't flipped circuits, as we've said, so in the same way that Trump was able to. So you take a circuit that had a majority of Republican nominees, generally speaking, those all still have a majority of Republican nominees. So he has had a significant impact. He stands to continue to do so. But I think whether he'll be able to surpass Trump will have a lot to do with who retires going forward. If today all the vacancies, even if he filled 100% of them, he still wouldn't have had the same numeric impact that Trump did. But we can't really predict going forward how many more vacancies will come. And I think it's also important to remember he's at the second half of his term, which typically is a slower time for nominations because, as I talked about with especially the district court judges, there's a lot of give and take with the senators. What a president will automatically always do is fill the lowest hanging fruit kind of seats first. He'll work with the senators who he's completely simpatico with. He filled all these blue seats right out the gate. So now he's going to have to find states, the purple and the red states, where he's going to have to actually make some compromises. That always happens. You'll have a president will say, okay, I've got 3 vacancies. You can pick one. I'll pick 2. We'll move them forward. That's what normally happens. That's why we're starting to hear rumblings on the left saying, hey, why should he have to work with senators at all? Let's get rid of the blue slip, which is the Senate term for the procedure by which senators from that home state can actually block nominees. That's why the presidents always have to work with them. The Democrats don't want to have to do a compromise deal like every president has always had to do in history. They want to just move forward full steam ahead. So you're getting some people, especially the liberal dark money groups, who kind of are always pedal to the metal, don't take a compromise for an answer. They're trying to get rid of that process. I hope they aren't successful because I think there is a real value in that, in making sure that those red state senators get their say on a few of these. But we'll see.
Here's the big question for you, and many of us see this on social media. I have friends on social media who make this point regularly. They say the current Supreme Court is illegitimate, that somehow President Trump stacked the court, that he packed the court with his nominees, and it was done somehow, they always say illegally, illegitimately, whatever. It's always expressed in connection with an outcome they don't like at the Supreme Court. So, you kind of get where they're coming from. Questions on that. First, do they have a point? And second, how do we respond? What's the right way to answer when people make that claim?
Yeah, well, I think it's telling, as you say, not just that they're complaining about illegitimacy simply because they see decisions they don't like, but that the reasoning for this illegitimacy is ever shifting. So, 20 years ago, the court's illegitimate because Bush didn't win for real, and because Bush v. Gore, and we disagree with that decision, and therefore Bush wasn't really president. He shouldn't have been able to appoint anyone. Okay, right. And then then fast forward to, well, the court's illegitimate because there's no way the Senate could have refused to take a vote on Merrick Garland's nomination and say our way of giving advice and consent is waiting for the next president, and then we'll tell you what we think. And so that must be illegitimate. Then they'll say, well, Gorsuch is illegitimate because he didn't get, they had to get rid of the filibuster to put him in. Okay. Then they'll say Kavanaugh is illegitimate because we thought that having multiple hearings and multiple extra FBI investigations of allegations that never had any corroboration to begin with isn't enough. So he's illegitimate. And Amy Coney Barrett is illegitimate because Justice Ginsburg should have retired earlier. And how could she have the temerity to stay on the court and die so close to the election? I mean, they'll invent a new rationale every single time. And every rationale they come up with, if you actually look at history, there's nothing to what they're saying, whether it's people saying, oh, well, you can't not have a vote on a Supreme Court nominee just because it's an election year. Well, that's happened. Most of the election year vacancies where the Senate was of the opposite party of the president, 2/3 of those, they didn't have a vote in the election year. So
and advice and consent includes no.
Yeah. So there's for every example they're doing, there's historical precedent saying, yeah, that's exactly what happens. And I'm sorry you're disappointed, but you don't get to try to change the rules of the game or claim it's illegitimate because you disagree. It reminds me of the people trying to pack the court now, because the people who say, well, we want to add more judges to the court because we just don't like what these judges are doing. You know what? This is not a good reason to change our entire system, our whole Supreme Court system. So when you see people whose reason is really just I don't like the result, rather than go back and say, wow, I'm frustrated that people elected someone who appointed judges I disagree with. You know what we're going to do? We're going to go bring our message to the people. We're going to try to elect people of a different perspective. That's what has been happening for the last 50 years. Ever since Bork, when he got borked effectively, and people said, wow, we need to work on this. We need to have better judges who are going to be more faithful to the Constitution. It's taken 50 years to get an originalist court, but it was the slow, hard work of saying this needs to be a top issue. We need to educate people. We need to train lawyers. We need to train new young judges about it. We need to express this to our elected representatives, that this is something we take very seriously and value as an electorate. And that's how you do it. And trying to short circuit that is really, that's not the American way.
And sometimes I just did laugh at the brashness of those who make that claim. But at its heart, it goes to foundational principles about the nature of the American experiment, about the foundations of our government. Why is it a dangerous thing to go around saying the Supreme Court is illegitimate? Why does that bring problems to our system of government?
Well, we sort of have started to see this in a lot of areas of our society, where you're having people making these broad claims like this is an illegitimate government. Well, if it's truly an illegitimate government, then maybe you don't owe it your allegiance and you don't need to obey our laws. That's what that really kind of goes to. Wow, if they really are illegitimate, which they're not, of course, even when I disagree, I can disagree with who was elected president. I can disagree with who's elected for my senators and my members of Congress. That doesn't mean I am not going to obey them. That's a really striking at the heart of the rule of law. It's very much like saying, free speech for me, but not for thee. And when you're hearing these loud voices on college campuses where they don't want anyone they disagree with to have a voice. It's like people saying that speech is violence, because that really says, oh, well, I can respond to violence with violence. I can, if it's self-defense, I can use violence. It gives them the excuse to use violence. And I think calling our courts or any branch of our government illegitimate does exactly that. It really invites that kind of response. Unfortunately, it's part of a real pattern of an increase in threats against our justices and in threats against the judiciary from the top to the bottom that I think is very, very troubling and is putting them, their families at physical risk, but also puts our very government and our system of the rule of law at risk, because it relies on us respecting, even when we disagree with the outcomes of this process. And if half of America is saying I'm never going to respect it if I disagree with it, we've lost our the beauty of an American system that allows for peaceful transfers of power and peaceful respect for the rule of law, for laws that we don't disagree with, or we may not agree with, but that we have to still follow.
All of this, for many people, seems far away, seems like it's in Washington, nothing I can do about it anyway. How can regular people speak into this process as engaged citizens? What's our role in this?
Well, I think we have more input into who's in the court than maybe we think. Obviously, I don't get to nominate or vote for anyone myself, right? Neither do you, unless the president or the members of the Senate are watching. In which case, hello, and please vote for solid nominees. But we do elect the people who do at the federal level. So I think the more that our elected representatives recognize this is really an important issue, the more responsive they will be to making that a top priority. Historically, I think that was one of the big shifts that's happened over the last 50 years. You had people like Eisenhower and Nixon who weren't looking in any way at their judicial philosophy of their nominees because they didn't think it was important to the American people. And maybe it wasn't at the time. Maybe they didn't realize how significant it was. And they were appointing people like Earl Warren, the most liberal justice in the Supreme Court, right? Bill Brennan, Harry Blackmun, these people who are some of the author of Roe versus Wade. They're Republicans, and these are really shifting that. And I think that has taken a long time to shift. And in the last election, it was very clear, or not in the last election. I feel like that was a much bigger challenge. I think people were fighting on both sides really hard. But the previous election, when Donald Trump was elected, that was, I think, where it became most clear, because the American people saw that the Supreme Court was on the ballot. Justice Scalia's seat was vacant. Yep. This is the person who's going to be filling that seat. And we saw that most Americans really took that seriously. And 1/5 of voters said the Supreme Court was their number one issue, not just any issue, their number one issue. That fundamentally is why the president realized, okay, I have to follow through on this. If every time someone is elected, they realize, hey, the people who elected me want to make sure that top issue is getting sure I get the judges right. Then we don't have someone who's going to be, saying, oh, this is just kind of one more political back and forth. I'll trade that for the vote on this, no, this is important. And we can see it now because Trump's executive orders are already out the window. The laws that he tried to pass, they're undoing them every chance they get. The judges, they're there for a generation, and they're the ones who are now our constitutional backstop when Biden is trying to push all of the constitutional limits with his own administration. And remember, it's also, we've talked a lot about the federal courts. It's not just the federal courts. A lot of you live in states where the judges are elected. It's an election that often a lot of people don't even vote in because they don't have a lot of information about it. It's tough, but get informed. Find out who these people are and make sure you're voting for someone who will be faithful to the Constitution as it's written. If you're in a state where the governor is the one who's doing the appointment, make sure the governor knows that, hey, this is one of the big reasons I'm voting for you, is that if I know that you are going to have a good record on judges. Because again, even if they don't think that's important to the people who elected them, it's not going to be important to them, and it's just kind of going to get lost in the shuffle of their priorities. But we see a huge difference in states where governors, when they have that authority, take it seriously and appoint great courts, and to places where they don't, because state courts, that's where 90% of the cases are decided, and they can make stuff up just as much as the Supreme Court can, and with almost more problems, because it can be harder to see and harder to check them on it. So
very good.
Get informed and make sure you're there trying to hold your elected officials accountable.
Tell us about the work of the Judicial Crisis Network. What do you do?
Yeah, so we were founded because we saw, in 2005, we saw the direction that this fights on judges were going. And so we were there to make sure that the people who were being attacked from the left, unjustly attacked, were going to have someone defending them. So we're there kind of in season and out of season, defending the good nominees. And hey, I'll defend any of President Biden's nominees if they're also committed to the rule of law and the Constitution. I want to see good judges on the court. We also do a lot of commentary just on the Supreme Court in general and on the cases. I clerked at the Supreme Court for Justice Clarence Thomas, now, lo these 17 years or so, but bringing that understanding of what's going on in the court and trying to make sure we're there to help break down what the cases are really about for the American people, because so many times, the media doesn't always get it right. Sometimes even just because they're not lawyers and they don't understand what's really at issue in the case, they see, oh, this is a case about, fill in the blank hot button issue, but often the legal realities are maybe a little more nuanced or harder to convey, and that gets lost in the 5-second soundbite. So trying to make sure that there's smart discussion of the courts happening is another big priority of ours.
Very good. Where can people find you? What's your website?
Yeah, our website's judicialnetwork.com. I also blog at National Review Online's Bench Memos blog, and I also am on Twitter at JCN Severino.
Very
so
good.
Check me out there.
Lots of good insights in there, Carrie. Thank you so much for sharing all that. Very helpful. Appreciate it. Anything else you want to share before I let you go?
Well, just one final word, and I think it's especially one that people at First Liberty will recognize the significance of, because we're seeing judges, particularly those who share these values of freedom of religion, being attacked left and right. I think of people like Judge Kazmierek in Amarillo, Texas, who's a former attorney with First Liberty. I think of people like Judge Kyle Duncan on the Fifth Circuit, who recently got attacked at Stanford. Just shouted down, not by students alone, but by administrators at the university, simply because he had the audacity to, be someone who has conservative values, who had, for example, defended his state's marriage law before he was on the court, obviously, or been willing to defend the state of Louisiana when in its laws protecting fetal life. the amount of vitriol and threatening behavior that's being directed at judges is outrageous. And I think we need to make sure that we are doing what we can to defend them, both to defend their reputations, to pray for them when they're being attacked like this, and to stand up publicly and say, we don't want to live in a country where our judges are being threatened this way. That's something that happens in third world countries. That's where they should be. You might think a judge would have to worry about his or her safety in their decisions, not in America. And I think we need to be very clear across the board that this kind of bullying of our judiciary won't be accepted.
I completely agree. Very well said. Carrie Severino, thank you so much. Appreciate your time today. We wanted to end this episode with a special update for you. We just launched something new that you might be interested in. I know many times you watch these episodes and you find yourself thinking, boy, I'd like to hear a more in-depth explanation of what happened at the court. Maybe you're an attorney or you're close enough to the legal profession, knowledgeable enough about it, that you want a more nuts and bolts explanation of what happened down into the weeds, if you will, into the detail of it. Well, we've got a new podcast. It's called The Case for Liberty. And that podcast is specifically to answer that need that we know people have been having, that they want to get into the nuts and bolts and all. So if that's you, you can listen to it on any podcasting platform. You can also go to firstlibertylive.com, and on the navigation bar up at the top of the page, now there's a new tab that says Listen. So firstlibertylive.com, click on Listen, and that'll let you listen to the most current episode and also find the archive. But again, if you already have a podcast app that's your favorite on your phone or whatever, just search for The Case for Liberty, and you'll find it there. First Liberty Live, fighting for what matters most.